Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you're from, and welcome to the Digital Empowerment Project, Module 10 on digitizing 3D collections in museums. The Digital Empowerment Project is a nationwide initiative organized by the 6 U.S. regional museum associations dedicated to providing free, self-paced training resources focused on digital media and technology for small museums. This series of online webinars and toolkits is made possible by funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We're delighted to have you with us here today. My name is Dan Yeager, and I'm the Executive Director of the New England Museum Association, and I'll be your host for this final module of the series. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the places in which we gather. In this era of virtual meetings, when digital spaces may substitute our physical sense of place, it's important to reflect on the land we each occupy and honor the indigenous people who have called it home. I'm speaking to you from Swampscott, Massachusetts, north of Boston, the historical homelands of the Massachusetts peoples. Wherever we are, let us acknowledge all indigenous nations as living communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We, the Digital Empowerment Project team, recognize that our organizations and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society that perpetuated the exclusions and erasures of many Native peoples throughout the United States and beyond. We ask you to reflect on the place where you reside and work, and to respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form the richness of our world and our profession. Thank you. And now for just a few housekeeping notes before we introduce today's presenter. First, I'd like to acknowledge today's ASL interpreter, who will be on the left side of your screen, and let you know that captioning for today's program is embedded in a box just below the YouTube player on our website, with controls to adjust your experience. Following today's program, we ask that you complete a short survey to give us feedback. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat stream, and we'll email a link to those of you who pre-registered. We'd greatly appreciate it if you'd share your experience with us and help us improve our work. We encourage you to pose questions to our presenter, which will be addressed at the end of the program after the presentation. Please type your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many questions as time allows. However, we may not be able to address all questions during the live session, and other questions may arise after reflecting on this program. For this reason, we've set up an online community forum for raising questions, posing answers, and connecting with your fellow museum practitioners on the Museum Learning Hub website, which you can find at museum-hub.org. If you're looking for help between programs, please visit this forum, create a login, and post your questions. A member of the community or one of our student technology fellows will get back to you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for our Module 10 intro workshop, Daniela Larsen, the Executive Director of the Hutchings Museum Institute in Saratoga Springs, Utah. Daniela is a certified National Geographic educator specializing in digital media and cultural diplomacy. She's created virtual reality experiences, 3D exhibitions, and digital knowledge banks for cultural preservation. And get this, she's led expeditions to the Mount Everest Base Camp, Madagascar, Mongolia, and several other locations for educational and cultural exchange. Daniela has implemented conservation projects in Utah, empowering participants to use technology for citizen science and impact in their local communities. She's created several online science and history programs for local schools, provided internships, and created several opportunities for municipalities to participate in conservation and geographic education. Daniela has experienced firsthand the power of technology in allowing diverse cultures and geographies to collaborate on identifying and solving our world's issues together. Please join me in welcoming Daniela Larsen. Daniela?
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to start off by telling you a little bit about our organization and where we're at. As part of that, as you can see our building up on the slide, the land acknowledgement that I wanted to share with you is going to come in significantly later as part of the presentation. So there's a couple of tribes and issues that I want to pull out, and how we've been able to use digital media to help solve some of the issues that we're facing. I'm just going to read it off screen right here. It is our honor and responsibility to acknowledge to all who meet here that we gather on the land that is sacred to all Indigenous people who came before us in this vast, crossroad for the Timpanogos, Utes, Goshutes, Paiutes, Shoshone, Navajo, and Hopi peoples and their ancestors. It has been their stewardship for time immemorial to care for this land and all of its inhabitants, both two and four-legged, winged, and waterbound. We honor their memory, their physical presence in our state today, their ancestors' presence here in spirit, and we do so in our reverence for their resilience in persevering in preserving their connections to the Creator. We honor the people, we honor the land. As I said, this is going to come in significantly. And in our state, it's been interesting because our Cultural Alliance and our the Governor's Board of Indian Affairs here has issued guidelines for each organization to create their own land acknowledgements. And in some ways, that has caused a lot of controversy. We're going to just take a little step back in time as we talk about the museum. And how we really got into doing a lot of the digital things that we're having so much fun with right now. This is our building. We're actually housed in what is called the Veterans Memorial Building. It's one of the now, if you're back east, it doesn't sound that old, but for us, it's pretty old out here in the West. It was built in 1919 by the veterans of World War I. And so it was originally the Veterans Memorial Building. Since then, it's been used as the city offices. It's been the jail. It's been a lot of different things. It's got a lot of really great ghost stories and just a lot of really, really great history in the building. Let's see, I need to make sure I've got okay, I just want to confirm it's moving my slide. Okay. This is a really fun topic to talk about because things in collecting and how we educate and the purpose of museums and everything has changed so much over time. Sometimes we're born into the world that we're born into, and we think that we just assume it's always been that way. And as we talk to children and students and things about how things used to be, it gives us a really good perspective on the fact that things are always evolving. So just a little bit about our founders, John and Eunice Hutchings. This is John Hutchings over here by this cave up on, it's Mount Timpanogos, which is, if you remember from the land acknowledgement that I read, is named after the Timpanogos Tribe here in Utah. And at first, this cave was just a tiny little cave opening, and he was just a prolific explorer. He was a collector, just ultimately curious. We still hear so many stories of people who are older now and acknowledge the start of their careers being to John and his willingness to let them tag along and never make anybody feel dumb for asking a question. All the field trips that went to when their collection was originally housed in their garage to go and look at the things that they had in their garage. His wife, Eunice, you can see here on the other side, she was quite the woman, first of all, for having the amazing patience to have somebody collect so many things. And she really got into it. She was a big part of it. She's up here collecting eagles' eggs out of a nest up here on a cliff in this picture over here. I wanted to talk a little bit about what kind of technology was used at that time to collect and preserve, and what their intent was for collecting in the early 1900s. They were right there around like the turn of the century, where they were starting to do some of these things, and I don't think we realize sometimes how cumbersome it was to collect and preserve information, and what a problem this has become in technology and in preserving technology. So the first picture that we've got here on the left, it's a plate and bellows camera. And it's fun to see how some film photography is making a little bit of a comeback right now. But this plate and bellows sure isn't coming back quite yet. It's a little bit fun to see some of these older things, gaining some popularity. But for the most part, most everybody's just taking a picture on their phone, and it goes, into a cloud somewhere, and that has its own problems that we'll talk about a little bit later. But carrying something like this camera up to a cave that you had to scale a mountain to, or go up to, maybe take pictures of eggs, it made it pretty impossible to do that. And so things were collected in with a very different mindset in a very different way. The picture in the middle is of a wax cylinder recorder. Honestly, before I came to work here at the museum, this was not a piece of technology that I was familiar with. They recorded on these wax cylinders, and a lot of these wax cylinders are still around. And it's one of the issues that we face is, how do we take things that were recorded on these wax cylinders, um, and get them digitized in a way so that they can actually be accessible by people now. There is a huge collection that we're working with at the Library of Congress that was made by a really awesome gal by the name of Natalie Curtis, where she went around and recorded a lot of the dances and rituals and prayers of the Native American tribes. And this was at a time where it was illegal for them to perform their bear dance, the sun dance, a lot of their sacred rituals. And it took a lot of courage, not just from her to do that, and as a young woman in those days, to insert herself into some of these really untamed places that were really unsafe, especially for a single white woman traveling around the West, but for the relationship that she had and the courage it took from the tribal leaders that were willing to share those things with her, knowing that there's a possibility that they could be punished for that. Sometimes they would get special permission, but sometimes they would just do it. They understood the significance of saving a lot of that for their posterity, and could see how a lot of that was being cut off as the tribes were being moved around and families were being separated. But that collection of wax cylinder recordings is still in that original form. A big part of it has never been digitized. It's still at the Library of Congress. And that's one of the projects that we're working on this year in partnership with the Hopi tribe and National Geographic, to get those recordings in a way that they can actually be used, because they're not helping anybody there. And I'm sure we can all imagine the nightmares of how wax could disintegrate over time. The picture on the right here then is just note cards. A lot of the collection was just done on pen and paper, little notes like this that John took and just stuck with tape to a box, or just had boxes of little loose leaf things like this, which made it really, really difficult to, as things get moved around over the years, things get separated from their original boxes. Um, and there's not a way to put them together. There's just a lot of information that becomes unusable because it hasn't kept up with the way that we learn now. The other thing to really consider are the attitudes and laws about collecting back at the time, when our collection was started. The history of museums, I think, is something that we just don't talk about often enough, and it's so interesting to think about. Museums are really such a new concept. They're It used to just be, private collections, that when young adults would go do their grand tour of Europe, they were traveling around and seeing people's private collections. Barnum was given the credit for having like the first real museum of, it was more of a cabinet of curiosities here in the US, where they just collected all sorts of things that were different and interesting from all over the world. And not just things, but people as well, people with different disabilities or illnesses that were, put on display just as a curiosity. The attitude of the times and the zeitgeist of that generation is very, very different than how we think about things now, which leads to problems. So most of our collection was gathered before NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves and Protection and Repatriation Act. That only came out in 1990. And getting that information out to all of museums and helping people understand it. Even in 1990, that would have been a really hard thing to do. There, I think I graduated from high school in 92. I hadn't even heard of the internet at that point yet. And, so thinking about how slowly we could disseminate information and guidance, or even a training like this, um, how impossible something like that would have been, and to help people kind of evolve in how we think about the things that we collect, the respect that we show them, how we interpret them, as opposed to how we would have done it in a circus sideshow if it was, something different. This was also before the Antiquities Act from 1906. Our collection has a lot of petroglyphs that were just basically just cut out from the mountain and just put into the museum. And we can't go and put those things back. How can we use technology, 3D modeling, digital media to try to rectify some of these things that were done in the past, is one of the things that has really led us to the exploration of digital media. It was also before the Archaeological Resources and Protection Act of 1979. A lot of these things are very, very, very recent, where the community at large wasn't worried about people not spray painting petroglyphs and digging up burial sites and things like that. And it's been a slow and steady, education. We deal a lot with private land issues and trying to really guide the community without frightening them when they do find, things in their area that maybe should go into a museum. People become really afraid if they don't have if they don't know what to do. They think, finding a burial on their property is going to completely stop a construction project. And we've heard nightmare stories where people will find human remains and throw them out because they're afraid it's going to stop them building their home or the shed. And technology has become a really powerful tool to help guide and educate people on, just call us, we're in and out in 2 days with the state. We'll come in and find the right places for those things and make sure that it doesn't stop the things that you're trying to do. But it's been it was very hard before technology to get that education out to people. And then finally, the Paleontological Resource Preservation Act as well. Excuse me. Our museum is peoples and culture and natural history. John collected everything from fossils, plants, and animals to Native American. There's so many Native American relics out here, and grave sites and things like that. And so our collection is very broad. And then over the years, as he really became known as the go-to guy for if you found something and wanted to interpret it or find out like what it was, people would bring those things to John, and more often than not, they would leave those things for his collection in the museum. Okay, so a little bit about me. I was born in 1974. I'll let you calculate my age. My birthday's on Christmas Day. I think I've turned 47 for the last 5 years. My kids keep telling me that. As was mentioned, I'm an educator for National Geographic, and that has led to a lot of just really great collaboration with other explorers around the world, and the exchange of knowledge that also was not a possibility before technology. So comparing a little bit of what technology was like when I was born to when the Hutchings, were around. We had rotary phones, which, they didn't back then, but wow, it was really amazing. I remember some really spoiled kids had 2 phones in their house. And if they were really spoiled when they were teenagers, they had their own phone in their room. Like that communication, ability to communicate. You still only had one line, but you could talk from your own room was pretty amazing. We were recording things on tape recorders. typewriters and carbon paper, film camera, these old big video cameras that were so hard to, to move around and cumbersome. It made it really difficult to go out into the field and record something and bring it back. These card catalogs, I remember those so fondly. Um, trying to explain to young adults and teenagers now how we would look for information before Wikipedia was around, and some of the problems that we also create by thinking that the only information that exists is on the first 2 pages of Google right now, where there was sometimes access to a lot more information when you had to look for it in different ways. And then, of course, cell phones as well, and everything that we can do with them. And then even just in the last couple of years, the LiDAR scanning capabilities that have come out with iPhones and iPads that have really been a game changer for a lot of the petroglyph preservation, and creating virtual tours and 3D modeling has been really amazing. My technology journey, it was funny when they first asked me to speak at this. I'm used to teaching the technical side of the technology that we use, and after talking to them, to the organizers, they were like, we just basically want you to inspire people that they can, if you can, it was basically, if you can do it, anybody can do it. And it made me laugh a little bit, but it's so true that we can. I think sometimes we get a little bit overwhelmed at how much and how fast the world is changing, especially if we have stepped out of the world a little bit. I started college in 1992, and then took some time off to have my family. And my kids led me into so many interests that I never would have had on my own. I had never been interested in fossils or rocks, or things that once you see them for the first time through the eyes of a child, they become really, really interesting. Our family had a nonprofit that we were working with, and we were doing economic development work in Madagascar. And I had really been looking for somebody to create some online education. 1992, the internet was just coming out of, this thing that we were hearing of. But it was so expensive to do any kind of pay somebody to create online education. That's when I went back to school to the digital media program here at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah, just to learn how to do it myself, because I couldn't find anybody to do it. And I really fell in love with the power, and saw the potential to connect so many different ideas in a way that we just could not do with just, paper and pencil and notebooks. I'm sure, as most of you know, when somebody asks you to be on a board, it really means, well, you work for us for free. And my kids had basically grown up at this museum, at the Hutchings Museum. They'd spent a lot of time there, playing in their rock and mineral room and doing all these other great things. And so they asked me to come and serve on the board and help the museum get some digital media going in 2007. Our city had decided at that point to, John Hutchings in 1955 actually donated his whole collection to the city of Lehigh. And the city was basically running it just like they were running the rec center, hiring, some 16-year-olds to check people in at the front door. There really wasn't a lot of bandwidth to do a lot of real curation, updating the museum. So everything just really stood still for a really long time. The museum had no website. The collection catalog was all just on one hard drive computer that crashed. And so then everything was gone. It wasn't cloud-based or accessible by other people. And then so many records were just on paper everywhere, and paper that didn't match up to artifacts. There was a lot of inaccessible media. A lot of our interviews or recordings that John or Eunice Hutchings had done were on these old reel-to-reel players, and we had no way to play them. We ended up having to go to a university to digitize, to see if we could that because they had one in their collection, and then we could record the sound coming off. The same thing with, more of these wax cylinders. And so the first couple of years were just really digging into how do we update the technology. It was the first time that I really came face to face and saw the tragedy that we're facing with so many of our collections in such a powerful way. We're losing so much of history because it has not kept up with how we access it. It's still there, it's still recorded, it's still on a wax cylinder, it's still on reel to reel. But unless we have kept up with transferring that to something that makes it usable and accessible, it might as well just not be there because we can't access it or play it. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it's really fun in our museum because we are natural history and peoples and culture. We have the opportunity to really unsilo the way that a lot of things are taught. There is so much of this is geology, this is paleontology, this is history, and being able to apply some of the principles that we find in nature about survival is to how we work with our collections has been a lot of fun. And this is kind of our mantra at the museum, especially when things like COVID hit or other opportunities or challenges have come up. It's just so important to really adapt quickly to the new environment that we're in. One of the things that we really like to talk about, especially with our Native American Advisory Board, and a lot of our 3D modeling and collections have been around our Native American collection, is that it's not the winners that write history anymore. It's the writers, the videographers, the photographers, and the storytellers. This is, Larry Sespucci is on our Native American Advisory Board, and we're out here visiting some land that was basically taken from the reservation and given to small, they were like 10-acre plots in the middle of the reservation that were given to white settlers to homestead. And this is one of the old farmhouses, and he was up there and able to talk to us about the impact that had on the people that were there, what that did to the relations, share that oral history, and really get that side of the story. It really just allows us to have more than one version of a story and be able to be comfortable with the fact that two people can experience the same event in history very, very differently, and that there is room for both of those. We're stewards of the history. We're not trying to write it. We're trying to make sure that it is accessible and that all the versions of it are there. And so we can give different groups different opportunities to tell their stories. This is Darren Perry. He is also on our Native American Advisory Board, and he is the chief of the northeastern band of Shoshone in Utah, and has been an amazing advocate for keeping the story of his tribe alive and talking and using technology to do that. There are a couple of really large massacres in the history of Utah that are not talked about in the textbooks. There's a few reasons for that. And I had a really great discussion with a retired history teacher just a couple of days ago, and it really drove this point home where, I have nothing but absolute respect and admiration for public school teachers. There's absolutely no way that they can fit everything in. They take a lot of heat for what they can't fit in or what they should be talking about. But, he was so adamant about, for everything that we put in, we have to take something else out. There's only so much time in the day or in the curriculum for, fourth grade. The other thing too is, I don't know how many of you remember how interested you were in ethical, moral issues when you were in fourth grade. If you were paying attention to those things as much as you were paying attention to the cute boy or girl next to you in high school, that the real deep understanding of history and how it applies to the choices that we make now and how and what we choose to tell and talk about and preserve, a lot of those things are really more in the sphere of adult self-guided education. And as museums, I think that our role in that is more important than ever. It still breaks my heart the times that we see, we'll have children on a field trip and we're telling them about something, and we've had kids raise their hand more than once and say, is this going to be on the test? What are the parts I need to remember for the test? And that is not the point of understanding culture and the world around you. And there's nobody that can do it the way that museums can. And I think we really need to understand how important and vital our role is in shaping the future right now with that. Okay, the information that we are really losing right now, so much of it is a lot of old books that are out of print. As I mentioned earlier, so many of, especially like younger people, or even if you're just going to like a library, there's so many things that are out of print. One of the issues with the Timpanogos tribe here in Utah, if we so 2026 is going to be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's also 250 years that Dominguez and Escalante came through Utah and met with the Native Americans for the first time. And I'll show you a painting of that here in a minute. In Escalante's journal, he refers to the Timpanogos Indians that lived at Utah Lake. Almost every book that we have found that is written before 1920 mentions the Timpanogos tribe as their own tribe. Now, they are not federally recognized right now. They are actually still working on that. It was not an issue that I was aware of, how many tribes are still trying to seek their federal recognition. And when we started talking about the Timpanogos tribe, I started getting some really nasty mail from like registered letters from some of the other tribes that did not appreciate us acknowledging this other tribe. There's a lot of background with the history of the tribes and how friendly they are to one another, and sometimes they feel threatened. But once again, digitizing these older books, the OCR scanning capabilities that there are now, where we're basically creating an online library of a lot of these books that are out of print, the OCR, the optical recognition, so you can actually just like search for a word, in it, makes it really easy to search for events and times and places, or certain tribal names and things like that we just couldn't do before. And it's caused quite a bit of stir actually in the state, because there's a lot of people asking questions about what happened to this tribe. And it's been interesting to really take the stand of, we're just putting history out there. This is, at this time and place, this is what people thought and believed. We're not asking anybody to judge it, to condemn us for showing it. And it's interesting how sometimes it's not who you would expect to have a problem with you showing the information, that has the problem, but there's a lot of politics and things behind some of these issues, that just putting the primary sources online just actually solves a lot of problems, because then it's just not hearsay or he said, she said, that we've got a very strict standard of what we can report and talk about, and are always looking for primary sources. But it's so interesting to see how knowledge changes over time, or our perception of knowledge changes over time. And so scanning these books and creating this digital library and resource has been a very, very interesting project. One of the things that has come out of that, I'm going to click on this timeline that we created. Let me know in the chat if it doesn't work. I'm going to just try to go to the right one here. Oh, one more. Okay. This is the painting of the Bear River Massacre. And this year, our governor on Indigenous Peoples Day in Utah, the day after Thanksgiving, made this statement. And it wasn't anywhere online. We couldn't find it anywhere. Somebody had sent it to me, and I was thrilled to see it. But then there's also a lot of putting some action, behind it. He talked about, whereas we use this time to reflect on the history of Indigenous settler relations and pay special attention to the atrocities perpetrated by our forefathers, committing ourselves to avoid the mistakes of our past and forge a brighter future. As the Timpanogos Tribe had actually approached us and given us some of their histories that they had. And we started just vetting sources. One thing that was referred to several times was this special order number 2. And we have it also, let's see. Oh, great, you can still see that. We've transcribed it, because look at what other problem we have with transmitting information to another generation. How many of our teenagers could read this? I can hardly read this, but I know a lot of the kids that are coming through now haven't even learned cursive. So again, there's information that is not accessible. This is basically an extermination order that was given from the state to the Indians that were down at Fort Utah. We had seen this referenced in several books, the extermination order, but had never seen it. We had been looking around and hunting all over, and finally found a citation where it mentioned that it was at the state capitol on microfilm somewhere, and that and it had the roll of the microfilm. And so we went digging, and that was the only place that this document was. Even our state historian said, oh, I'd heard of this, but I'd never actually, seen it. Being able to keep that part of history alive, it meant so much to the Timpanogos Tribe and to the Indians of Utah to know that we were acknowledging these things, that because they've been passed down orally from traditionally through them, but nobody on the settler side is aware that these things have happened. There's no way that we can, in a textbook, include all of this information. There is just so much that has been left out that there just is not room to teach. One of the most powerful things that digital media allows us to do is include so much more than we ever could before. Let's see. This is a sample of one of the 3D models that we've done of a Native American basket. And it really allows us to share a lot of the artifacts and things that we have with other researchers and with other explorers. If any of you guys have heard of a movie called What Was Ours, I would highly, highly recommend it. It deals with the issue of Native American artifacts in museums. And we really want to use so many of the things that traditionally are just stored in our basement to really just educate and inspire the cultures that they come from, and not necessarily having to have them come to us to see those sorts of things. Let's see. So this pot right here, this is the 3D model of the pot. And what's really great about this is all of the tribes have access to this as well. Their historians do. You can zoom in and out. You can see really closely. You get different tribes have given us different interpretations of what this, the symbol that most of us would at first glance connect with a swastika or Nazis, would be. And we've had a couple of different interpretations. Some of the tribes that are currently here are offshoots of tribes that were here 200 or 300 years ago that have separated. And so sometimes we'll get more than one interpretation. But this allows them to have access to our whole collection, and to provide, there's enough space to put more than one interpretation on here about them. And so that's been a really, really fun, powerful thing to do. We've also created digital tours. So if people can't, especially, the tribes can't come to the museum itself, or sometimes they wouldn't come unless they really, understood the things that were there. With digital tours, anybody can see it from anywhere. These are all accessible through Google Glasses or any kind of VR as well. And so you feel like you're actually in the room, and then you can pull up information on the different artifacts. And again, one of the most powerful things is the fact that there's unlimited space here. These can hold videos of different, you can get so much. We've had so many more visitors make comments about the virtual tour than we have about the live experience, just because they have access to so much more information sometimes here virtually as well. So just to finish up here, let's see, the right one. It doesn't want to, let's see. Okay, the challenges. Everybody's not really excited about all the forgotten stories that we're telling sometimes. Sometimes people get really defensive. They would like us to leave that extermination order on microfilm buried in the vault at the state capitol. It takes a lot of cultural diplomacy. So to be able to help people understand why, but really holding space for all of these stories is so important. We do really see when we're scanning old books and looking through things that are out of print, we do see that there are tribes and stories and events that have changed in how we tell them. And too many times we go by the current textbook or by what's on Wikipedia or what we find on the first 2 pages of Google. And we're not really looking for primary sources on where that information is coming from. And digitizing collections like this really allows us to do that. And then keeping up with the changing technologies for a lot of these old record types. It wasn't too long ago when we thought everything was really safe forever because it was on a CD-ROM. And now most computers come without a CD. The opportunities, though, that this provides, again, the unlimited space to include a lot of stories, a lot of artifacts, and to give anybody that has an internet connection the ability to handle a pot, not handle, but virtually handle a basket without having to touch it. Every time we touch something like that pot that I just showed, there's a chance it can get, destroyed. The speed of the compounding data that we're collecting and sharing is astounding. This is a book that I read just recently. It's A New History of Life. And it basically talks about how everything we knew about dinosaurs 20 years ago is wrong, where before scientists and paleontologists and archaeologists had to go from museum to museum and scour through their basements and collections to come up with ideas. Having everything digitized and working towards that allows them to access that from anywhere, and it helps synthesize our knowledge a lot faster. It really allows us to have multiple ages and interests participate in history in different ways. There's a way to interact with different exhibits in VR that is a really great starter for a lot of kids that might not think that they love history. But it's a really great hook, and taking the knowledge and helping them fall in love with it to where they are and where they feel comfortable is something that technology really allows us to do. And it's just the opportunity for all of us to realize that we'll never be done learning. There is so much more that is coming out and changing. And I'm thrilled that there's resources like this that can provide training on some of these emerging technologies. I've got my contact information here if anybody wants to ask me anything offline. But I think right now, if we have some time for a chat, that would be great. I'd love to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Daniela. It was terrific. So I think some of the questions that we've gotten so far relate to maybe having you walk us through a little bit about how you actually go about doing this. So like, where does the digitization role fit into your overall museum? How many, do you have a person that's assigned to it? Do you do it in-house, or do you have consultants? How much time does it take for you to, sort of triage these things and get it done in equipment, and, all of those sorts of maybe nuts and bolts thing as they apply to your institution?
Sure, I'll give you that. I'll give you the really condensed version, and then again, I'm happy to send more information on any of the technical things. It's been a lot of trial and error. One of the things that our museum does is we work with a lot of neurally diverse volunteers, young adults that are on the autism spectrum. Sometimes they are the most amazing ones to dive deep into a technology and play with it and really like figure it out. We've had to be really open to giving people the opportunity to try and fail and try different things. Watch different like YouTube videos. But there's a few technologies that we have settled on. We use Sketchfab for our 3D modeling, for example. We use the LiDAR on the iPhones to do the LiDAR scanning of different things. So we do have some set things that we do use to create those things and processes, and I'm happy to share those. It's probably more time than we've got right now. But as far as our process goes, we once we figure out what works, it's like the whole like user experience, both for oftentimes it's a volunteer that is going to be creating something after we figured it out, to how it gets to online, making sure that we've got processes in place so that they can actually teach those things to others around them. And then take, especially as we've been working with Native American youth on the reservations and teaching those things there, they're pretty quick to pick up. You really don't need a degree in any of this to learn how to do it in a couple of days. Mm-hmm. It's very doable.
Do you have a studio set up in the museum where you have a special space?
We have a light box that we do a lot of our smaller objects scanning and stuff in. The supplies for a lot of these things are actually really not very expensive. You can do it with just simple equipment that you get on Amazon. And so we have in our workspace upstairs, we have a kind of a row of things that are waiting to get digitized that, fit into that. And if there's things that are bigger, we'll do that in just, a big open room. But one of the projects we're working on with the state right now is scanning, excuse me real quick, is scanning a lot of the petroglyphs, and even trying to figure out where the petroglyphs that we have in our museum originally fit, because you can take, you can take different pieces of a 3D model and place them together. And so sometimes that work is just done outside, and it's just with the LiDAR on an iPhone. Excuse me.
What's the difference then between, sort of handling two-dimensional scanning versus three-dimensional? Is it a different process, or does it just kind of fit into the same project management?
No, it's very different. Especially, OCR, the optical recognition, has not been out that long. I don't know how many of you remember when you used to scan in a page, it would come in as a PDF, but it couldn't read the actual words on it, right? You at least had a digital copy, but But now when we can scan in a book and type in the word Timpanogos, and we see all the times this tribe is mentioned, in a book, that's really powerful. But that's actually a really new update. The scanner that I showed a picture of earlier in the presentation is what we use for that. It's very quick, and it puts things into just, Google Drive, into a Google Doc that can be shared. So that's one process. So we've got a scanner and a computer that's set up to do that. The 3D modeling, all of that is done more with cameras and iPhones and a light box. And so that's a different station that is set up.
How does that work then? Do you have like one camera that you actually take multiple pictures of and then stitch them together, or do you have multiple cameras, boom, all at once?
That would be ideal, but no, the first way, just the one camera. And honestly, I think we learned how to do it in just a couple of days, watching YouTube videos and experimenting. Um, and it stitches it. What There's
Mhm.
some different softwares that just stitch it all together that are free, especially for museums or nonprofits that are available. That I'd be happy to share those sources as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they just get. We had to get a better computer that was a little bit more powerful than like a Chromebook. A pretty heavy duty PC that just does the 3D modeling, and so that is like set up and dedicated to that station.
Mhm.
But it was something that we were able to go and shop around for grants for, just because it's something that you can show, to people, and they can, put their name on it or something like that. And it's fun to where we live. It's referred to a lot of times as Silicon Slopes. We've got a huge technology hub right here, and a lot of times people think of museums as like these old stuffy places where old things go to die that nobody cares about, and bringing them back to life with technology like this has enabled us to get grants for things like this, the scanners or the cameras
Mhm.
to use.
And what did you say that software was you use for the 3D?
We use one called Polycam.
Polycam. Okay.
Mhm.
Very great. And so then when you do that, you've got the Polycam that creates the models. And what is the ultimately that then dovetails with whatever collections management software you've got, the traditional stuff, you patch that file into the software, or how does that work for you?
Well, we are in the Google Arts and Culture program.
Okay.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Um, and so we use the back end of that for a lot of our collections management, because it's cloud based, and then we can all access it from anywhere. We can choose which fields are visible online and which ones are private. We don't necessarily want people knowing exactly where our most valuable artifacts are located in our storage or something like that. So it's nice because you can hide those things, but you can also add those files to that. And so then we have like a 3D model of it, along with, and it keeps like the donor record attached. Any other information or anything that we have just stays all together. But
Mhm.
yeah, it all lives in there in one place.
You mentioned the sort of, okay, you've got these now staged, ready to go to be digitized. How do you actually make the decision of what the priority objects are and which items can and should be um, digitized? And I'm curious also specifically with NAGPRA, are there NAGPRA issues that would prohibit you from actually digitizing some or making more urgent to digitize some as you may be returning objects to the tribes?
Um, that's a great question. Yes and no. NAGPRA really deals with funerary items, human remains. We would never digitize human remains and make a model, of those things, um, just out of respect for how the cultures feel about doing that. Uh, Now it's very different with, we have human remains and human leathers from um, a a young man that was hung for stealing somebody's water. People died over water out here in the West all the time. And with the drought right now, I think we're right back to that point where, people are fighting over water rights everywhere. It's very different. So depending on how that particular culture feels about that, I think there's NAGPRA, and then there's a much higher law of just respect and empathy for how they would want that, treated and respected. So we're really working on, I think we've gone through our collection. Everything that needs to be repatriated definitely has, but we're working with several tribes to help them create their own interpretive centers on their reservations and try to return as much as we can, to them, so that they can use them to educate and inspire their own people instead of those things, living in our basement. So a lot of those things, yes, we will digitize before they leave, if it's not something that would offend anybody to do so.
Have you received any pushback on items that you've already digitized from folks that have just said, "Hey, that shouldn't be up there at all"?
Not that, but what the feedback that we've received is what we've asked for is it, all we know is what we have from John's notes, where he found it.
Right.
One of the issues out here, a lot of tribes used to be referred to as the Anasazi. I think even that basket used to say, or there was a bowl, it wasn't that basket, there was a bowl that said Anasazi basket. Well, and everything when I first came to the museum was labeled Anasazi, this, that. Well, Anasazi means ancient enemy. The tribe reached out to us and said, "Hey, we would prefer if you called our ancestors the my goodness, my mind just went blank. The ancient Pueblo. They had like a different name that they wanted us to use, and that's exactly the kind of like feedback that we want to get, because unless they are willing to talk to us and tell us how they want the objects that we have used or talked about, all we have is how people were talking about them back in the 1920s, which is not how we talk about a lot of things now.
Right. Right. Well, I'm sure a question on everybody's mind is the funding. How do you actually get funding for these projects? You mentioned that you've gotten some grants for it and the like. What are the sources for this? Is this IMLS? Is this local partnerships? Those kinds of things?
It's been, excuse me, for these ones, for us, it's been mostly corporate sponsorships that we've really gone after. And just, it's taken a lot from me as the director, really having a position where my role is more facing out of the museum and helping the community understand our vision, the technology companies, applying, we're basically teaching 21st century skills with a lot of these things. The Department of Workforce Services sometimes pays us to teach these young adult autistic young men and women to do some of these things, because it gives them a marketable skill that they can do. And so sometimes we get, funding, through that, making sure people understand that a lot of the skills that people learn and are using to do these things are transferable into the marketplace. Matterport is the software that we use to create virtual tours, and we've done that at different archaeological sites and things as well. That is, real estate agents pay like $600 to $700 a pop to have a Matterport tour created of a home that they're selling or a business. And so sometimes once they see that the things that we're doing are not just like old stuffy things about our basement and are actually impacting the future as well, and really helping them see like the vision of that, we've been able to get some corporate sponsorships to, buy us a $5,000 scanner or some of the camera equipment and things like that.
Right. Interesting. And in terms of the objects that you digitize, what I'm curious is what happens to them. Do you find that once you digitize something, there's less of an inclination to actually bring them out on display, in real life? Do they just go back in storage, or like what is your relationship to the object as a museum once you get it, in a digital form?
Right. One of the things that Perry Murdoch, who's from the Timpanogos Tribe, said, I picked something up one time without gloves on, but it was like stone. It wasn't something that I would usually put gloves on. It was part of a tomahawk. and he said the gloves aren't to protect the object from you, it's to protect you from the object. He was talking to me about like our relationship with objects, and if that was a tomahawk that had been in battle and had killed somebody, the energy that that's carrying. And since then I've thought so much more about my relationship to the objects, because I've always thought about protecting it from me, not the other way around, right? We have the things that are in cases are harder sometimes to get out, that are on display. The things that are in storage, nobody has seen for 70 years. So we're digitizing a lot of the things that we have in storage first, and they go back into storage. But there's a way for people to experience them digitally. They can like scan a QR code in the Native American room, and it takes them to all the things that are in storage that are digitized as well. And so it creates an opportunity for those things to be seen. We're planning to do, we're about halfway through a capital campaign to expand by 70,000 square feet. So we're going to be bringing a lot more of our collection out, but digitizing those things that are in storage has been a very powerful tool for the fundraising that we're trying to do, to show people, look at all these things that nobody can see as well.
Well, thank you, Daniela, so much. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but it's really been enlightening and inspiring. I hope everybody agrees. And folks, I hope that you'll stick with us as we continue through this final module of the Digital Empowerment Project. Join us next week, Thursday, same time, same channel, for Tech Workshop #1, How to Use Digital Assets for Documentation, Promotion, and Programs, featuring Roz McNulty. And so I'm sure that that'll deepen what it is that we've learned today from Daniela. On behalf of the Digital Empowerment Project and everybody associated with us, I'm Dan Yeager. Thanks for joining us.